Okay, I think we're going to get started now. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for our inaugural Telecom Economics 101 series here at the Phoenix Center. We were thinking about doing this, setting up this series for quite a while now. With the new technology, we can make it happen. And what we'd like to do with this series is hold it from time to time to have an opportunity to go through the complex and very nuanced economics of the telecom industry. We feel that it's very often overlooked, and we're very fortunate that the Phoenix Center has our chief economist, Dr. George Ford, who is an excellent professor who can walk us through some of these very complex issues. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Understanding the Economic Effects of the Bidder Exclusion Rules. As everybody knows who's probably on this call, we have the pursuant to the Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Creation Act of 2012, that the FCC is in the process of trying to design an exceedingly complex auction to try and get broadcasters to voluntarily give up their spectrum and to hold an auction to relieve spectrum exhaust in the U.S. wireless industry. This is going to be an exceedingly complex task, a very difficult process the FCC is working its way through. And one of the big issues that's come up over the last 6 or 7 months has been the question of whether or not, actually since the act was passed, is whether or not the FCC can write some sort of bidder exclusion rules, whether it's a spectrum screen, a spectrum cap, outright bidder participation rules, whatever it may be. The expectation, obviously, from the auction to raise a lot of money is high. And so the real issue comes down is whether or not, given that Congress has asked for so much revenue, will bidder exclusion rules help or hurt the revenue stream? So there's been a lot of talk, and we've done quite a bit of research. George will go through that in a minute. All of our research, of course, is available on our website, www.phoenix-center.org. If you're looking for our wireless work in particular, we've actually have a little wireless page. If you click up at the right-hand side of the page, you can see all of our work. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our chief economist, Dr. George Ford. George, why don't you take it away?
I wanted to start with some preliminaries to kind of give you an idea of what's going on here. My goal here is to discuss some very basic principles surrounding this issue. It's more of a layperson's discussion rather than the auction theorist discussion. These are conversations, or this is based on conversations I've had with people and also the research I've done in this issue, and I'm just really trying to provide some background material so that when you hear things come up, you can perhaps better grasp what's being argued. I also want to stress that it's really impossible to say what the exact effects of any sort of bidder limits or restrictions or exclusions will have, since such limits can take a variety of forms. You can restrict bidding to particular blocks, you can limit the number of blocks you can buy, you can use a spectrum screen with various levels. So we don't really know exactly what format such limitations would take, so it's very difficult at this point to say exactly what the effects would be. Moreover, the auction rules and even the ban plan are not yet finalized, and those things will, of course, have significant effects on the auction. Sometimes even what many might view as a trivial difference in auction design could have a huge impact on auction outcomes. Spectrum auctions are very complex. Carriers can bid across multiple licenses, can group licenses and change their grouping of licenses. The FCC has rules about how you bid and how you participate in those bids, keeping active, and those sorts of things. Those rules have all got to be established, and they are very important to the outcome. So this will be a very, very complex auction, so we're quite limited in what we can say way ahead of time without knowing what the rules are. And I would also stress that the auction is being designed by brilliant economists, a team led by Paul Milgram, who's, the name speaks for itself. We're very blessed in that regard in this country. We will have as good an auction as human beings can design. That's not to say it will be perfect or not have some defect that we'll later discover, but going into it, we will have a exceptionally well-designed auction. That said, the brilliance of the economists are constrained by a political process that has imposed a number of requirements on them. There's a great discussion of this by Paul Milgram on YouTube, if you want to look that up, where he goes through some of these constraints. And those constraints will continue to be applied. The bidder restrictions are one such constraint that has not yet been applied to them, but could be, which would change the way the auction gets designed and limit the ability of the theorist to produce an auction that is effective at doing what it needs to do, which is to generate significant amounts of revenue to cover some expenses that have been outlined already and to generate some money for our government to spend. Things you might want to read from us that are going to be related to this discussion are the papers listed here, Policy Bulletin 33, Policy Perspective 1303, Policy Perspective 1304. These are all very recent documents. They're all on the front page of our website, or you can click on the wireless link to get them. There's also a couple of blogs that I've authored recently that summarize these issues in a lighter language. I would also encourage, and it's not listed here, that you read the Wireless Competition Under Spectrum Exhaust paper, which I think is pretty important in the general discussion of how you allocate spectrum in the wireless industry. I discussed that also in the DOJ's Spectrum Screening Ex Parte filing paper, Policy Bulletin number 33. Okay, so I'm going to start just with some basic ideas. Some of these things many of you will know already, but let's have a basic auction here with one item for sale. It's the second price ascending auction. It's sort of an eBay style auction, which is roughly similar to what we've done in the past with spectrum auctions. You've got 4 potential buyers. Their values are listed above their heads, 110, 90, 60, and 40. You've got one item, and so in this setting, the winner is the highest valued user. The price that it will be sold at is the $90, which is the second highest value, or $90 plus some change. I'll just use the 90 throughout this presentation, but if there's an incremental bid, it would be 90 plus the incremental bid if the second highest bidder bids the 90. And if you're familiar with an eBay auction, you know how this works. Now, an alternative, and I use this alternative because this is part of the discussion that's going on. All I've done in this second example is to add 8 more bidders with lower values than the others. And what you'll see in this case is, again, and I didn't mark it here, well, there it is. Again, what we find is the winner is the highest valued bidder, and the price is $90. So the addition of bidders to the auction have not changed the outcome of the auction. And I just stress this because you hear a lot in the discussion that we need more bidders because more bidders will raise the price of the auction, but that's not necessarily true. That's based on some particular assumptions about the bidders. But what this shows you, and it's very simple, I don't think anybody here is surprised by what they see or doesn't understand how this would work, is that in an auction it really only takes 2 to tango, and that's a pretty important point. Whether we have 4 bidders or 12 bidders in the auction, the auction value is determined by the second highest bid. That's very significant in discussions that surround the discussions of the bidder exclusion rules. The argument that what you need is more bidders generally comes from the assumption that if we add more bidders, these bidders are being drawn from the same distribution that the high bidders are in, so that we're going to end up with more $110, $90 types than we would, say, a $20 type. That in a world of multiple incumbent bidders and sophisticated companies that buy and use spectrum, multi-billion-dollar companies buying things that are worth millions of dollars, it's not clear really that we're missing out on something if somebody leaves. I mean, who are these hidden high-value bidders for spectrum that are apparently not present in the auction because of the lack of a restriction? We can extend this simple auction to bidding, offering 2 items for sale, and also with the limit that the winner can only buy 1 item. And what we see here is that the third highest value turns out to be the price. The 2 winners, the 110 value and the 90 value, have to outbid the $60 value to win the auction. And so we have higher auction revenues. We've auctioned 2 things instead of 1, and the third highest bidder determines the value. Now, if we take that auction and same auction, the 2 items buy only 1, and we exclude the highest bidder, then what we find is that now the auction value is $40 per license, because the second 2 highest bidders have to outbid the 4th highest bidder. And we have a reduction in revenues. So we had, in the previous case, 2 licenses sold at $60 for $120 total, and now we have 2 licenses sold for $40 at $80. So by excluding high-value bidders, and the argument for excluding AT&T and Verizon is that if you put them in there, they'll win, which is explicitly states that they are the highest valued bidders. So this is relevant in that context. By excluding them, you're just moving down the food chain to the lower valuations, which means that revenues will decline. The open auction will produce the highest revenues. Now, when I'm talking about revenues, I do want to make clear that revenues may not be what is trying to be maximized, although I think in this case there's a pretty good argument that that is at least the number 1 target of the policymaker. Now, the argument that we often hear that if we exclude AT&T and Verizon from the auction or limit them in some way, that revenues will rise. Now, this is based on the argument that if AT&T and Verizon are present, that some of the bidders won't show up to bid, and that those bidders that aren't showing up are relatively high-valued bidders. From the literature, this argument is based mostly, there may be other cases someone may offer, is based on a monopoly incumbent versus entrant argument, and I've used this argument in certain contexts before, so I'm not criticizing the argument for what it is. I think the problem is it's really not the reality that we face. We live in a world of multiple incumbents, not a single incumbent. And in a world of a monopoly faced with an entrant, the monopolist, the monopoly profit is always twice as large as the duopoly profit. So the monopoly is always more interested in excluding entry or buying a resource than the duopolist or the entrant. In that case, the entrant understands this. The entrant won't show up, and the monopolist gets it for whatever the minimum would be, or get it for nothing. We've seen some cases of this that we cite in the paper where we have some problems with a lack of bidders. But the most important point here is that this idea is really pulled out of the literature and is based on a scenario that doesn't fit the reality of the market. Now, in some cases, we have in the past modeled monopoly outcomes, but the reason we do that is to assess the role of market power. In this case, assuming a monopoly versus something else has a very significant effect on the results. And as we saw above, in an auction, it really only takes 2 to tango. And as you'll see in the policy perspective I did on exclusion, that theoretically the presence of multiple incumbents has the effect I described earlier today would be expected to have that on revenues, of reducing revenues. Here's an example using what we've done before as to what the argument is. Let's say you've got one item to sell, again, to make it simple. And let's say that because the largest value buyer is in the auction, AT&T and Verizon practically, that the middle two values just don't bother to show up. And in that case, the high value user is only bidding against the low value user, the $40 valued user here, and so the price sold is 40 rather than the 90 if the two middle value guys have shown up. Alternatively, if we exclude the high value user from the auction, then the price would be 60, where the second highest value bidder outbids the third highest bidder because the highest value bidder can't bid. So you see here, this is sort of the argument that they present. If we run off these middle valued guys because the high valued guys are in there, then we're only competing with the lowest value bidder. You could even assume that that $40 is some kind of minimum bid. So that's generally the argument. The real question, I think, is why. Why is it that the middle valued, relatively high valued users are being scared off? And you wonder if this is a threat where the high valued users, which I think would most certainly be Sprint and T-Mobile. I mean, there are not a lot of guys that are interested in buying spectrum for millions of dollars. They're going to be the major carriers primarily, and then, some other guys, Qualcomm and even the cable companies in the past have purchased spectrum. So there are other people interested. Chevron purchased some spectrum, for example, too, the oil company. So really what's going on here, who's being scared off and why? And in the presence of multiple incumbents, the argument is pretty weak. Jumping down there, if you're an incumbent firm, why is it that you wouldn't show up and then and by doing so, allow your primary competitors to pick up spectrum on the cheap, particularly when you could come in, make a bid, and may actually win something? I've been doing some research on the 700 megahertz auction, and if you look, at least I'll give you preliminary results from that AT&T, for example, only wins about 40% of the licenses that it bids on, and Verizon's number is significantly less than that. That's in part due to the fact that Verizon won the C block license and just directed its attention there. But AT&T was an A and B block bidder, and Verizon was an A block bidder. And they don't win most of what they bid on, so the evidence is not very consistent with the argument that they're running people off. The other argument is that bidding is expensive, so if I don't really feel like I'm going to win, I'm not going to spend a bunch of money bidding. But I think if you look at the auction results, you'll see that's from the 700 megahertz auction that's a pretty weak argument. There were 214 qualified bidders in that auction, 101 separate winners. Some of one license, for example, for not a whole lot of money, which would suggest to me, at least suggest that the bidding costs are not particularly high. We can't conclude exactly that that's true, but it seems to reflect that. I also think that as we think about this incumbent versus entrance game, and I think this is in what many people are saying. We take the belief that there's sort of two perceptions of what these exclusion rules might do. One is to keep the spectrum out of Verizon and AT&T's hands and put it directly, almost the DOJ's argument, directly into the hands of Sprint and T-Mobile, whereas others may be thinking, oh, well, we'll give some new guy the possibility of winning the spectrum. And that's generally what most of the literature on spectrum auctions is about, is allowing someone new to buy spectrum, and by acquiring spectrum, then they can become the fifth nationwide provider of wireless service. I think the prospects for a fifth nationwide provider of wireless service are slim to none, and we're running at 4 now, and the bottom two, the smaller two, are struggling financially. So I think the prospect for additional entry is pretty low. We had the cable industry, who certainly could employ significant spillovers with the spectrum they acquired, end up selling the spectrum and not entering because they concluded it was way too expensive to do so. And you also observed Dish, who recently has spectrum and acquired some spectrum and got it repurposed for terrestrial use. They're actually looking for a partner among existing providers. So I really don't think there's a very strong argument for additional entry or to rig the auction to encourage additional entry in the space. But that's a policy call. Other people may have different ideas about that. I would stress, because I thought about this and have been asked about this on a number of occasions about what's the revenue effect, and there have been some studies on that, the one from Georgetown, for example. And my research on this and my thinking on this is that it's exceedingly difficult to try to predict what the revenue effect would be, mainly because we don't even know what the auction rules are. And the other problem is that the argument that is being made for the bidder restrictions or exclusions is that the presence of AT&T and Verizon in the auction alters the mix of bidders. And that's a very different question than saying, what if it's the same set of bidders and AT&T and Verizon are hypothetically pulled out? That's really not the argument that's being made. So in fairness to that argument, it's pretty difficult to figure out what the effect would be if you believe the mix will change. I question whether or not the mix of bidders would change. I don't know who's not showing up and who would show up that somehow brings a huge valuation to spectrum that wouldn't show up even if AT&T and Verizon were there. But people may disagree about that. So what we're actually stuck with, if we do try to estimate the revenue effect, is auction data without such a restriction. So we're drawing from a observation where the mix of bidders reflects the presence of AT&T and Verizon. Now that doesn't say we can't gain some insights from that data, but any conclusions or recommendations drawn from that should be qualified accordingly, and so that people understand really what's going on. One argument that has been used in the past for a revenue-enhancing argument is a set-aside. And this is generally what you see in the literature arguing that these auction rules might increase revenue. And what that essentially says is we're going to assign a block of spectrum only for an entrant, for example. And in this case, we might say we're going to assign a block of spectrum only for non-large incumbent providers, whether they be small incumbent providers and entrants as well. And we can see in this example where we have two items, A and B, and the high-value bidders are limited to item A. In that case, item A here has everybody can participate in that auction if they want to. That auction has a sale price of $90. And then in item B, we take out the higher two bidders and only have the smaller value bidders, and that sells for $40. The total revenue in that auction is $130. If you look back a few slides ago where we just had two items and whoever could buy them, the revenue was $120. And the reason you've created higher revenues is that you forced the higher bidders into a fight for one block. And then that drives up the price in that block, and then you allow the smaller guys to bid, which produces a lower per block price in the item B, but we've got a higher per block price in item A that increase the value. Now this depends on what you assume about value. I could create an example that wouldn't produce a higher revenue if I wanted to, but that's how the argument goes. The problem with this argument, and the literature stresses this, is that one of the highest value bidders, who's presumably a very efficient user of spectrum, and in a world of spectrum exhaust, would presumably be somebody who needed spectrum to meet their demands, doesn't get spectrum. and that has could have significant efficiency consequences and consumer welfare consequences. Here we're trading off efficiencies for revenues, and all the literature on this issue, exclusions and other auction manipulations, admits that this is a trade-off, and some of that is covered in the paper, my paper, and certainly in the papers that we cite. It's always the case that we are trading something, we're trading revenue for something else, or we're trading entry for something else. We might trade entry for efficiency. So we're always in a situation of trade-offs, and many times when we're discussing this topic, or some people are discussing this topic, not us, but some people, they forget that there's really a trade-off that we're dealing with here, and just assume that there is no trade-off, and that we can giving it to somebody new is better than giving it to somebody old, because giving it to somebody old doesn't have some positive benefit, which is obviously untrue. You have to contemplate the trade-offs, and in our work, particularly in the DOJ's paper, does that within the context of a standard model of competition, where we sort of specifically state, not sort of, we do specifically state what the trade-off is, at least in the context of that model. The incentive auction is a different game, and thus far we're sort of talking about, here's a block of spectrum I got to sell, which is what typically happens in spectrum auctions historically. We know what we've got to offer, and we set up the band plan and we sell it. This is a little different situation because the supply side is being determined at the same time, or at least in some sort of close sequence. And what we have is, in effect, I mean, it's not exactly this, and it really depends on how they design the auction, how close my statement here is to the reality, is that the broadcasters are in effect additional bidders, because they're saying, I'm not going to sell my spectrum if I don't get, $10 million for it. That is, in essence, a bid by a broadcaster to keep the spectrum in the broadcasting business. So you've got this additional element, which is really fairly significant, because what we have to have here is the mobile wireless sector outbidding broadcasters as well as outbidding each other for spectrum. But they also have to outbid the broadcasters for spectrum. And, of course, the higher the bids, the more spectrum they'll be brought to the mobile wireless industry. You can look at this example, and if this example proves to be wrong, I constructed it pretty quickly. I'll apologize ahead of time. But what you got here is potential buyers, 3 potential buyers and 2 potential sellers. The sellers here would be the broadcasters, and they say, here's what I'll take, here's what I have to have, my reservation price for my spectrum to get me out of the broadcast business. The first one is $30, the second one is $40. And the potential buyers have 2 valuations. One is for 1 block of spectrum. The second one in the column is for both. And it's not clear whether or not they could bid that way or not, which is why I rigged this way. But what you see here, if you have the 2 largest bidders in the auction, that you could generate enough revenue, regardless of how you rig the auction, whether you can buy one or both, to draw both blocks of spectrum, broadcast spectrum, to the auction. The first buyer would buy both if possible, although potentially being outbid by the second in this case. The second bidder would certainly buy at least 1 block, since its $35 valuation is larger than the $30 minimum valuation. These guys are going to fight over one of these blocks. So in this case, on restricted auction, you end up having both blocks brought. If instead you chose to exclude the largest bidder, then you only have enough value on the demand side to draw 1 block of spectrum, the first block. There's not enough value anywhere in that package to draw the second block. So excluding the high-value users or restricting them in some way, in this case we're just excluding them, you have 2 effects. One is sort of a revenue effect alone, standing by itself, which could be if you knew what you had to sell, like we have in the past. But in this case, not only might we reduce revenue, but we might actually reduce the amount of spectrum that gets transferred from broadcasting to the mobile wireless sector, which is pretty significant given the spectrum shortage that is widely viewed to exist in the mobile wireless industry. You can think about, I've used this example in discussions before, you can sort of think about the incentive auction as an eBay auction that has a reserve price. Because the broadcaster is only going to sell if the auction price exceeds the broadcaster's reservation price. It's the supply side part of the auction. On eBay, if you've ever done a reserve price auction, it's the case that the second highest bid must actually exceed the reservation price. So even if you had, let's say the reservation price is $100 and I bid $200 for the item. If nobody else bids $100, then the item doesn't sell, even though I've expressed my desire to buy the thing at well above the reserve price. You got to have two people bid above the reserve price. Now, I don't know how the auction would work. It may work, in a way that if the buyers signal that they're willing to pay higher than the broadcaster's reservation price, that it sells, even though there's not a second highest bid that exceeds that reservation price. I don't know, but design matters, and I'll leave the design to Paul Milgram and his crew, whose water I couldn't probably carry. The other issue I think that's very important in this exclusion issue is the foreclosure value. This is the basis for the Department of Justice's arguments or proposals, and also Dr. Jonathan Baker's proposal. Now, the argument is that AT&T and Verizon have foreclosure value, which I think is simply saying that they buy the spectrum just to keep it out of the hands of T-Mobile and Sprint or other competitors. But what they, neither the DOJ or others that make the foreclosure value argument have bothered to do is define exactly what they mean by foreclosure value, and this is significant. How do you analyze what the effects of foreclosure value are if you won't even define the term? And this is very specific. What it means, I think, it's not just some loose concept. It means something in particular, and once you define it, you can trace out what it means and what trade-offs exist by relying on it. We did define foreclosure value, and I think it's the proper definition of it. I don't know what other definition you'd come up with that has economic merit. Somebody may be able to do that, but I think we've taken a pretty basic approach to it, which says the foreclosure value is equal to what happens to me, my reduction in profits, if somebody else gets the spectrum other than myself. And what we find by analyzing it in a standard model of competition, that the simplistic argument that the presence of foreclosure value is sufficient to rig the auction is incorrect. The efficiency of the auction depends on relative use value and not simply the presence or absence of foreclosure value. It may very well be that AT&T and Verizon have enormous foreclosure values, but if their use value for the spectrum is higher than everybody else's, then the efficiency would dictate that the spectrum should go to them. So what has to be assumed by the Department of Justice and others that offer these restrictions based on foreclosure value is that the foreclosure value is very large and the use value is non-existent or very small. And I generally find that hard to fathom, given that we've observed that both AT&T and Verizon have had capacity and congestion issues on their networks and are active participants in the market, secondary spectrum market, to try to get more spectrum in particular markets to relieve that congestion, as well as the fact that we have pricing strategies to try to control usage. The usage-based pricing is an attempt to control usage to manage congestion or capacity constraints. So it's not a very good argument. Maybe somebody has one. I just haven't heard it yet. And if they do have it, they need to bring it. It's also the case, as we show in our paper on the DOJ's filing, that the small firms may have higher foreclosure values than the large firms. You can ask the question, would Sprint, say, gain more by keeping spectrum from Verizon and AT&T than Verizon and AT&T would gain from keeping spectrum from Sprint? I think that's certainly plausible that that's true. And so you have to begin to contemplate what exactly we're doing in this case. I mean, if we could, if some carriers could block the auction from happening altogether, would they desire to do that? And I think the answer may be yes, because the spectrum may be used so much more efficiently by the larger carriers. Now, people are going to have different opinions about that, and I think that's good that people do have different opinions about that, but we have to understand what that possibility means for good policy and consumer welfare. So my position is, and I've stated it plainly now a number of times, is that if you're going to use foreclosure value theories to rig the auction in a particular way, and rig the auction because you think this is somehow going to make society better off, increase consumer welfare, is what way the economists would put that, not increase consumer surplus, but increase consumer welfare, then it's up to you to define your terms and present a sound economic argument that supports it. Maybe they can do that. I've thought about it quite a bit and wondered how. And I mean, I suppose you could come up with something, but the question then would be, are the assumptions that you're making plausible? Would we believe it? And would you believe, for example, that AT&T and Verizon have no use for more spectrum? I don't find that to be a plausible assumption. Some people may. To date, all we've got on foreclosure value and the exclusions is speculation and assertion. And I cover that some in my paper released today. There's this argument that somehow increasing the given Sprint and T-Mobile spectrum is somehow going to radically change the competition that's occurred in this industry for decades. And I just, radical changes like that are really not a very helpful economic concept. You don't normally see economists arguing that when this happens, that there's going to be some radical shift in the parameters of the model, which is essentially what's happening. Maybe it's true. I'd like to hear a good argument about that rather than merely saying that giving the spectrum to these guys is somehow magically going to make them much more aggressive competitors. In fact, I don't know why necessarily that'd be true. You go and you spend billions of dollars on spectrum, and now you want to get into some price competition fight with other carriers when you just took on a few $1 billion of debt. That's normally not the way firms behave. In fact, they'd probably be discouraged from doing so. So if you want to say it's a legitimate argument, it'd be great to have a good sound layout that an economist could appreciate as to why that would work. The benefit of economic models is not to fancy things up or to use mathematics or throw Greek in papers. It's to force discipline into the argument so that all the explicit and implicit assumptions are revealed, and we can determine what the welfare consequences are. And when we do work at the Phoenix Center, it's almost always the case that the standard that the policy is judged by is consumer welfare. I mean, consumer welfare is the left-hand side of the objective function in our work, and I think if you're going to be making arguments for policy, that should always be the case. That summarizes. There's, of course, many other things we could talk about, but I did have a limit today of half an hour, which I've gone over significantly. But we do have 15 minutes now to take questions or comments if anybody has anything, or clarifications or any corrections that someone might have. Thank you for your time.
Okay, great, George. Thank you very much. All right, we'll give everybody a minute or two to type in their questions. We apologize for that part of the webinar software. It's not totally voice interactive, so we'll give it a minute here. All right. Well, in that case, if anybody does have any follow-up questions, we, of course, are always available by email and by telephone at the Phoenix Center. Please feel free to contact us if you have any further questions. And we really appreciate everybody coming out for our inaugural webinar series. We hope to be doing a lot more of these over the coming years. And please stay tuned. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.